Sandra Martinez stood in the scorching Arizona sun, sweat beading on her forehead as she watched uniformed personnel walk freely through the main gates of Blackwater military installation. For the third time in 20 minutes, she approached the security checkpoint, only to be turned away by the same stone-faced guard who barely glanced at her credentials before shaking his head dismissively. What he didn't know was that the unassuming woman in civilian clothes carried clearance levels that would make seasoned generals pause in respect. What happened next would shake the very foundations of military protocol and expose a web of corruption that reached the highest ranks of command. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday for Sandra Martinez. At 5:47 a.m., her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made her coffee grow cold in her hands. 3 words appeared on the screen: Phoenix, immediate, critical. Sandra had spent the last 8 years working deep within the intelligence community, her official title deliberately vague: Defense Intelligence Analyst Level 7. What that really meant was that she knew things that could topple governments and had access to information that existed in fewer than 12 copies worldwide. Her security clearance wasn't just top secret, it was what insiders called beyond black, classifications so sensitive they didn't officially exist. The drive from her modest apartment in Tucson to Blackwater military installation should have taken 90 minutes. Sandra made it in 70, her mind racing through possibilities. The message had come through channels reserved for absolute emergencies. Either someone had discovered something catastrophic, or something catastrophic was about to be discovered. Blackwater wasn't like other military bases. Officially, it was a training and logistics facility for special operations. Unofficially, it housed some of the military's most sensitive research projects and served as a coordination hub for operations that couldn't be traced back to any government agency. Sandra had been there exactly twice before, both times escorted by armed security details who treated her with the reverence reserved for someone who could end careers with a single phone call. This time was different. This time, she was alone. The base materialized from the desert heat like a mirage, its concrete walls and razor wire standing in stark contrast to the endless expanse of sand and scrub brush. Sandra pulled her rented sedan up to the main security checkpoint, expecting the usual protocol. She would present her identification, the guards would make their calls, and within minutes she would be whisked inside with full military courtesy. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Corporal Danny Hutchinson, a 22-year-old from Ohio who had been assigned to gate duty for exactly 16 days. Hutchinson took one look at Sandra's civilian clothes, dark jeans, white blouse, and sensible flats, and immediately categorized her as another contractor seeking base access for routine maintenance work. "Purpose of visit?" Hutchinson asked, not bothering to look up from his clipboard. "I'm here on official intelligence business," Sandra replied, handing over her identification card. The card itself looked unremarkable, a standard government ID with her photo, name, and a series of numbers that meant nothing to the untrained eye. Hutchinson glanced at the card for perhaps 3 seconds before handing it back. "Ma'am, you'll need to contact the appropriate department to schedule your visit. Contractors aren't permitted unannounced access to the facility." Sandra blinked, momentarily stunned. "I'm not a contractor. Please look at my clearance level." "Ma'am, I need you to turn your vehicle around and exit the premises. If you have legitimate business here, you can call during normal business hours to arrange an appointment." For a moment, Sandra considered pulling rank. She could have made one phone call that would have Hutchinson reassigned to the most remote outpost the military could find. Instead, she decided to give the system a chance to work properly. Mistakes happened, especially with young soldiers who hadn't yet learned to recognize the subtle indicators of high-level clearance. "Corporal, could you please call your supervisor? I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Hutchinson sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with a difficult customer. "Ma'am, my supervisor is in a meeting. You'll need to move your vehicle." Sandra pulled her car to the side of the access road and waited. And waited. 20 minutes passed before she approached the checkpoint again, this time hoping a different guard might be on duty. Instead, she found Hutchinson joined by Sergeant Mike Torres, a career military man who should have known better. "Sir, I'm Sandra Martinez with Defense Intelligence. I have urgent business on base." She presented her ID again, this time making sure both men could see the classification codes clearly printed on the card. Torres barely glanced at the identification before shaking his head. "Look, lady, whatever you're selling, we're not buying. This is a secure military installation, not a shopping mall." The dismissal in his voice carried an edge that Sandra recognized all too well. She had encountered it throughout her career, the automatic assumption that a woman, particularly a Hispanic woman in civilian clothes, couldn't possibly hold significant authority. It was a prejudice that had followed her from her early days as a junior analyst through her rapid rise to positions that required presidential approval for appointment. "Sandra, I'm not selling anything. I'm here on orders that came through intelligence channels this morning. If you would just verify my clearance level." "Ma'am," Torres interrupted, "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave the premises. If you refuse, I'll be forced to call the military police." Sandra felt the familiar burn of frustration mixed with something else, genuine concern. The message that had brought her here wasn't routine. Someone with her clearance level wasn't summoned to a place like Blackwater for paperwork or consultation. Lives were at stake, and she was being blocked by two men who were too proud or too prejudiced to admit they might be making a catastrophic mistake. She returned to her car and tried calling the number that had sent the original message. The line was dead. She tried her handler in Washington, straight to voicemail. Her backup contacts produced the same result. Either there was a massive communication breakdown or something had gone very wrong since she'd left Tucson.
Meanwhile, inside the base, Colonel James Whitfield was growing increasingly agitated. The morning briefing had been delayed twice, and the Defense Intelligence Liaison who was supposed to provide crucial insight into their current crisis was nowhere to be found. Intelligence assets in 3 different countries were reporting the same disturbing pattern. Someone was systematically compromising operations that should have been completely secure. "Where the hell is Martinez?" Whitfield demanded, causing his aide to jump. "Sir, we've had no communication from Defense Intelligence this morning. Should I try to contact?" "Try to contact? Lieutenant, we have people dying in the field because someone is feeding information to hostile forces. Martinez has clearance on operations that could expose our entire network. She should have been here an hour ago." What Colonel Whitfield didn't know was that Sandra Martinez was sitting in a rented sedan less than a quarter-mile away, watching base personnel come and go, while 2 guards refused to acknowledge that the solution to his crisis was literally at his doorstep. As the Arizona sun climbed higher and the temperature soared past 100 degrees, Sandra made a decision that would change everything. She had spent her career working within the system, following protocols and respecting the chain of command. But sometimes the system failed, and when it did, people died. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a secure satellite phone, technology so advanced that its existence was classified several levels above top secret. There was one number she could call that would bypass every protocol and cut through every level of bureaucracy. It was a number reserved for absolute emergencies, the kind that threatened national security. As she dialed, Sandra didn't know that her decision to use that phone would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military command, or that the 2 guards who had dismissed her would soon find themselves at the center of an investigation that would reshape how security clearances were verified and respected. The phone rang once before a voice answered, crisp and professional. "This is General Patricia Hayes, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. State your emergency." "General Hayes, this is Sandra Martinez, Defense Intelligence, clearance level Omega 7. I'm currently being denied base access at Blackwater installation despite urgent operational requirements." The line went silent for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for General Hayes to pull up Sandra's file on her secure terminal. What she saw made her blood pressure spike. Sandra Martinez wasn't just any intelligence analyst. She was the architect behind Operation Nightfall, the woman who had single-handedly prevented 3 terrorist attacks in the past 18 months, and currently the only person with complete knowledge of an ongoing counterintelligence operation that had tentacles reaching into 12 different countries. Ms. Martinez, you said Blackwater? Stand by. General Hayes immediately conference called Colonel Whitfield. The conversation that followed would become legendary in military circles. Colonel, this is General Hayes. Do you currently have Sandra Martinez attempting to enter your facility? Whitfield frowned, checking his watch. Negative, General. We're still waiting for the Defense Intelligence Liaison. Our morning briefing has been delayed because... Colonel, I want you to personally walk to your main gate right now. There should be a Hispanic woman in civilian clothes being detained by your security personnel. You will escort her to your command center immediately, and you will treat her with respect due to someone whose clearance level is higher than yours, mine, and the base commander's combined. The silence on Whitfield's end stretched uncomfortably long. General, with respect, there's no one at our main gate except... He stopped mid-sentence as the implication hit him. Except what, Colonel? There's been a woman trying to get on base all morning, but she looks like a contractor or something. My gate guard said she was persistent but didn't have proper authorization. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. General Hayes's voice dropped to a temperature that could freeze helium. Colonel Whitfield, you have approximately 3 minutes to personally retrieve Miss Martinez and get her to your operations center. While you're walking, I suggest you pray that whatever intelligence she's carrying hasn't been compromised by this delay. Because if American lives are lost due to your gate guard's inability to properly verify clearance, you'll spend the rest of your career explaining it to a congressional committee. The line went dead. Colonel Whitfield burst from his office like his uniform was on fire, leaving behind a conference room full of bewildered staff officers. He actually ran across the base toward the main gate, his mind racing through the implications. If he had kept a high-level intelligence asset waiting outside his base for over 2 hours due to security guards who couldn't properly read clearance codes, his career wasn't just over, it was obliterated. Sandra was still sitting in her car when she saw a full colonel sprinting toward the gate in the desert heat. She watched with professional interest as the man, presumably Whitfield based on the name tape, arrived at the security checkpoint red-faced and breathing hard. "Where is she?" Whitfield demanded. Corporal Hutchinson pointed toward Sandra's sedan with confusion. "Sir, if you mean the woman who's been trying to get on base, she's right there. But we've already explained to her multiple times that she needs to schedule an appointment through proper channels." Whitfield looked at Sandra's car, then back at his guards, then at the car again. The cognitive dissonance was almost visible. The woman sitting calmly in the driver's seat looked like someone you might see at a PTA meeting, not someone whose phone calls could mobilize special forces units or whose signature could authorize drone strikes. He walked to Sandra's car and tapped on the window. She rolled it down with an expression of polite inquiry, as if men with eagles on their collars ran to her car every day. "Ma'am, are you Sandra Martinez?" "I am." "From Defense Intelligence?" "Correct." Whitfield felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Ma'am, I'm Colonel Whitfield, base commander. I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. Would you please accompany me to the command center?" Sandra studied his face for a moment. She had seen that exact expression hundreds of times, the dawning realization that someone had made a career-ending mistake. Part of her wanted to make him squirm, to let him fully understand the magnitude of the error. But people were dying, and personal satisfaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Of course, Colonel. Should I follow you, or would you prefer to escort me personally?" "I'll ride with you, if that's acceptable. We can send someone for your vehicle later." As Sandra drove through the base gates that had been barred to her moments before, she noticed the guards' expressions. Corporal Hutchinson looked like he had seen his military career flash before his eyes. Sergeant Torres was actually pale despite the desert sun. Both men now understood that they had just refused entry to someone whose security clearance was so far above their pay grade that they literally didn't have the authority to question it. The command center was a study in controlled chaos. Multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe, secure communication lines buzzed with encrypted traffic, and a dozen officers moved with the urgent efficiency of people dealing with a genuine crisis. "Ma'am," Whitfield said as they entered, "before we proceed, I need to formally apologize for the delay at the gate. It was completely unacceptable, and I take full responsibility." Sandra nodded curtly. "Colonel, we can address protocol failures later. Right now, I need to know what intelligence prompted my emergency summons." Whitfield led her to a secure briefing room where 3 other officers waited. Major Rebecca Chen, the base intelligence officer, stood as they entered. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, head of counterintelligence operations, was studying a tablet with deep concentration. Captain David Rodriguez, communications specialist, was monitoring multiple secure channels simultaneously. "Gentlemen, Major Chen, this is Sandra Martinez from Defense Intelligence. She has Omega-7 clearance for this briefing." The change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Major Chen's eyes widened slightly. She had heard whispers about Omega-7 clearances, but had never met someone who actually held one. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson sat down his tablet and gave Sandra his complete attention. Captain Rodriguez actually stood up straighter. "Ms. Martinez," Major Chen began, "we've been tracking a series of security breaches across multiple theaters of operation. In the past 72 hours, 3 separate classified operations have been compromised in ways that suggest someone with high-level access is feeding information to hostile forces." Sandra took the briefing folder and began scanning its contents. What she saw made her blood run cold. Operation Midnight Sun, a deep cover insertion in Eastern Europe that she had personally helped design, had been blown. 2 operatives were missing, presumed captured. Operation Desert Rose, an intelligence-gathering mission in North Africa, had been compromised so completely that the entire network had to be extracted. Operation Phoenix Dawn, a counter-terrorism operation in Southeast Asia, had been exposed just hours before execution, forcing a complete abort that left assets stranded in hostile territory. "The pattern is precise," Lieutenant Colonel Thompson continued. "Whoever is doing this knows exactly which operations to target for maximum damage while minimizing their own exposure. They have to have access to operational planning at the highest levels." Sandra studied the timeline. The first breach had occurred 18 hours after she received new intelligence about a terrorist financing network. The second had happened 6 hours after she briefed a select group of officials about emerging threats in North Africa. The third had followed immediately after she submitted a classified report about potential security vulnerabilities in Southeast Asian operations.
"Colonel," Sandra said quietly, "I think someone is using me as a targeting mechanism." The room went silent. The implication was staggering. If Sandra's communications, briefings, or reports were being monitored, then virtually every sensitive operation in the intelligence community was compromised. Her clearance level gave her access to information that spanned multiple agencies, countries, and operational theaters. "That's impossible," Major Chen said reflexively. "Your communications are encrypted at levels that don't exist outside of NSA headquarters. Your briefings are conducted in secure facilities with jamming technology that would block signals from a satellite. Your reports are hand-delivered through courier systems that haven't been penetrated since the Cold War." Sandra was already 3 steps ahead. "Unless the breach is coming from inside those systems. Major, I need you to pull the access logs for everyone who had knowledge of my movements in the past week. Not just who knew where I was going, but who knew when I would be there. Ma'am, that list would include some very high-ranking officials. I don't care if it includes the president. Someone is using my operational footprint to identify and compromise sensitive missions. If we don't find them, more people are going to die." Captain Rodriguez looked up from his communication station. "Ma'am, we're receiving reports that Operation Arctic Wolf may be compromised. That's the counterintelligence operation targeting Russian infiltration of European defense networks." Sandra felt ice form in her veins. Operation Arctic Wolf was so classified that fewer than 20 people worldwide knew of its existence. She was one of them. If that operation was blown, it would take years to rebuild the intelligence networks they would lose. "Who else has access to Arctic Wolf intelligence?" she asked. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson consulted his secure terminal. "The operational team consists of you, General Hayes, CIA Director Patricia Vance, NSA Deputy Director Michael Foster, and—" He stopped, his face going white. "And who?" "Defense Secretary William Crawford." The silence in the room was deafening. Secretary Crawford was a decorated veteran with 40 years of service to his country. He was also, Sandra realized, the one person who would have had access to her operational schedule, her briefing topics, and her intelligence reports. He was the one person whose clearance level was high enough to access the most sensitive operations across multiple agencies. "We need to consider the possibility," Sandra said carefully, "that Secretary Crawford is not acting in America's best interests." Colonel Whitfield looked like someone had just told him the sun was made of cheese. "Ma'am, with respect, that's Secretary Crawford. He's been serving this country since before most of us were born. And he's in the perfect position to cause maximum damage," Sandra replied. "Think about it. Who would have the access, the authority, and the trust necessary to systematically compromise our most sensitive operations? It would have to be someone at the very top of the defense establishment. Major Chen was already pulling classified files. If you're right, we need to identify every operation that Crawford has had access to and assume they're all compromised. We're talking about potentially hundreds of ongoing missions across 6 continents. There's another problem," Captain Rodriguez interjected. "If Crawford is working with hostile forces, then he knows about this conversation. All communications from this base are logged through Defense Department systems that he has oversight authority for." Sandra stood up abruptly. "We need to get out of official channels immediately. Everything we've discussed in the past 10 minutes has to be assumed to be compromised. Colonel, I need you to clear this room of everyone except your most trusted officers. We're going to implement emergency protocols that exist outside of normal command structure." "Ma'am, I don't understand." "Colonel, there are procedures in place for situations where the normal chain of command has been compromised. These procedures exist for scenarios like foreign invasion, military coup, or, in this case, high-level infiltration by hostile forces. I'm invoking those procedures now." Sandra reached into her briefcase and withdrew a secure communication device that none of the officers had ever seen before. It looked like a standard tablet, but was clearly something far more advanced. This is a Sentinel device. It connects directly to a secure network that operates independently of all Defense Department systems. There are exactly 12 of these devices in existence, and they're used only when the entire government structure is potentially compromised. She powered on the device and began entering a series of codes. Within seconds, she was connected to a secure channel that bypassed every normal military and intelligence communication system. "This is Martinez, Authentication Omega 77 Alpha, requesting immediate secure conference with designated emergency response personnel. We have a potential compromise at the highest levels of government." The response to Sandra's emergency signal came faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, the Sentinel device connected to a secure video conference facing faces that made everyone in the room stand straighter. Admiral Sarah Mitchell, Director of National Intelligence; FBI Director Jonathan Blake; NSA Director Catherine Wells. These were people whose names appeared in classified briefings, but who rarely interacted directly with field personnel. "Ms. Martinez," Admiral Mitchell's voice came through crystal clear despite the encryption. "Your signal indicates potential compromise at cabinet level. Explain." Sandra quickly outlined the pattern of operational failures, her analysis of the timing, and the disturbing connection to Defense Secretary Crawford's access to her activities. As she spoke, she watched the faces on screen grow increasingly grim.
The operational security failures coincide perfectly with my briefing schedule and intelligence submissions. Someone with access to my movements and reports is using that information to identify and compromise the most sensitive ongoing operations. FBI Director Blake leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, what you're suggesting would constitute the largest intelligence breach in American history. We need more than circumstantial evidence before we can move against a sitting cabinet member. Sir, while we're gathering evidence, more assets are being burned. We have people in the field whose lives depend on operational security that no longer exists. NSA Director Wells spoke up. Sandra, we've been running parallel analysis on communication intercepts from hostile intelligence services. In the past week, we've detected unusual activity suggesting they're receiving real-time intelligence about American operations. Your assessment supports our findings.
Admiral Mitchell made a decision. We're implementing Broken Arrow protocols immediately. Ms. Martinez, you're now operating under emergency authority. Colonel Whitfield, your base is being designated as a secure operations center outside normal Defense Department oversight. Everything discussed in this room is now classified beyond top secret under presidential authority. Colonel Whitfield looked stunned. Admiral, I'm not sure I understand the implications. Colonel, what it means is that your base no longer reports through normal military channels. You now report directly to this emergency committee. Any communication with Pentagon officials, including Secretary Crawford, is suspended until further notice. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. They were effectively declaring that the normal chain of command was compromised, removing an entire military installation from Pentagon control and operating under protocols designed for wartime emergencies. Major Chen was studying intelligence reports on her secure terminal. Admiral, we're seeing confirmation of the pattern. 3 more operations have gone dark in the past hour. Someone is accelerating the timeline. Sandra felt a chill of recognition. They know we're onto them. Someone tipped them off that we've identified the pattern. That's impossible, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson protested. This conversation is happening on secure channels that Crawford doesn't have access to. Sandra was already working on her Sentinel device. Unless Crawford isn't working alone. Admiral, I need authorization to access the complete access logs for everyone who knew about my emergency summons to Blackwater today. Granted, full disclosure authority. What Sandra found in the logs made everyone in the room reconsider everything they thought they knew about the scope of the conspiracy. Her emergency summons had been logged in the system exactly 17 minutes before she received it. That meant someone had known she was being called to Blackwater before the call was even made. This is orchestrated, Sandra said quietly. Someone wanted me at this base, at this time, discovering this pattern. We're not investigating a security breach. We're walking into a trap. The video conference erupted in urgent discussion, but Sandra was already 3 moves ahead. She pulled up the personnel files for everyone who had interacted with her since arriving at Blackwater. What she found sent ice through her veins. Corporal Danny Hutchinson, the young guard who had refused her entry, wasn't from Ohio as his personnel file indicated. His background check showed discrepancies in his education records and employment history. More importantly, his assignment to gate duty at Blackwater had come through an emergency personnel request filed just 2 weeks ago. Sergeant Mike Torres, the career soldier who had dismissed her with such contempt, had received a commendation just 1 month ago for exceptional performance in security protocols. The commendation had been signed by someone in the Pentagon whose signature authorization codes traced back to Secretary Crawford's office. Colonel, Sandra said, interrupting the heated discussion on the video conference, I need those 2 gate guards detained immediately. Not questioned, detained, full security lockdown. Ma'am, on what authority? Admiral Mitchell's voice cut through the confusion. On my authority, Colonel. Detain them now. But when Colonel Whitfield sent security personnel to the main gate, they found the checkpoint abandoned. Both Hutchinson and Torres had vanished, along with their weapons and all electronic equipment from the guard station. They had an extraction plan, Sandra realized. This whole thing has been a setup from the beginning. Someone wanted me to discover the pattern of compromised operations. They wanted me to identify Crawford as the likely source. And they wanted me to do it at a location where they had assets in place. Captain Rodriguez looked up from his communication station with alarm. "Ma'am, we're detecting unauthorized transmissions from somewhere on the base. Someone is broadcasting on encrypted channels." Sandra's mind raced through the implications. If hostile operatives were on the base and actively transmitting, then everything they had discussed was already compromised. But more than that, her presence at Blackwater had been used to confirm the effectiveness of their intelligence network. "They're not just stealing our secrets," she said. "They're testing their penetration capabilities. They wanted to see if they could manipulate our highest-level intelligence assets into a specific location and set of actions." FBI Director Blake's voice came through the conference system with urgency. "Sandra, we're receiving reports of hostile activity at multiple intelligence installations across the country. Whatever signal your presence at Blackwater sent, it's triggered something much larger." NSA Director Wells added grimly, "We're detecting coordinated cyber attacks on classified networks, unusual movement of personnel at sensitive facilities, and communication spikes between known hostile intelligence services. This looks like preparation for something massive." Sandra suddenly understood the full scope of what they were facing. It's not just about stealing intelligence. They've been mapping our entire response system. They know how we react to security breaches, which personnel we trust, what protocols we follow under emergency conditions. They've been studying us. Admiral Mitchell's expression was grave. "Ms. Martinez, what's your assessment of the current threat level?" "Admiral, I believe we're looking at a coordinated intelligence operation designed to neutralize America's clandestine capabilities on a global scale. The operational compromises were just the opening move. Now, they're moving to eliminate the people and systems capable of responding to the attack." As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding throughout the Blackwater facility. Emergency lights bathed the command center in red, and Colonel Whitfield's communication officer began receiving urgent status reports.
"Sir, we have multiple security breaches at the perimeter. Unknown personnel attempting to penetrate the facility from 3 different directions. Defensive positions," Whitfield ordered immediately. "All non-essential personnel to secure areas." Sandra was still focused on the larger picture. "Colonel, this is a distraction. The real attack isn't happening here. It's happening everywhere else, while our attention is focused on defending this base." She was right. Reports began flooding in through the Sentinel device of simultaneous attacks on intelligence facilities across the country. CIA stations were going dark. NSA listening posts were being compromised. FBI counterintelligence operations were being rolled up by hostile forces who seemed to know exactly where to strike and when. "They've been planning this for months, maybe years," Sandra realized. Every piece of intelligence they stole wasn't just valuable information, it was part of a comprehensive map of our entire national security apparatus. Major Chen was coordinating defensive measures when her secure terminal chimed with an incoming priority message. What she saw made her face go pale. "Ma'am, we're receiving intelligence that Secretary Crawford has called an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the security breaches. He's recommending immediate changes to intelligence oversight and operational protocols." The brilliance of the plan became clear. Crawford wasn't just stealing secrets, he was positioning himself to control the government's response to his own attacks. By calling for emergency measures and protocol changes, he could institutionalize access to intelligence that would normally be compartmentalized beyond his reach. "He's consolidating power," Sandra said, "using the crisis he created to expand his authority over intelligence operations." Admiral Mitchell's voice carried a new urgency. "Sandra, we need you to do something that goes beyond your current authorization. We need you to activate the Prometheus Protocol." The command center went silent. Even Sandra paused, understanding the magnitude of what was being requested. The Prometheus Protocol was a theoretical framework for intelligence operations when the entire government structure was potentially compromised. It had never been implemented, never been tested, and its very existence was known to fewer than a dozen people worldwide. Admiral, Prometheus Protocol assumes that normal governmental authority cannot be trusted. It essentially authorizes intelligence personnel to operate independently of all governmental oversight. That's correct, and based on current circumstances, it appears that assumption may be accurate. Sandra looked around the room at officers who had dedicated their lives to serving their country through proper chains of command and established protocols. What Admiral Mitchell was asking would require them to essentially go rogue, operating as an independent intelligence service accountable to no governmental authority. If we implement Prometheus, Sandra said carefully, we're acknowledging that the American government has been so thoroughly compromised that it cannot be trusted to defend itself. We're also accepting that we may be branded as traitors if we're wrong. And if we don't implement it, Admiral Mitchell replied, we may watch the entire national security infrastructure collapse while the actual traitors consolidate control over what remains. The weight of the decision settled over everyone in the room. Outside, the sounds of gunfire indicated that the perimeter attacks were intensifying. Inside, secure communication channels were reporting the systematic destruction of intelligence assets across multiple continents. Sandra made the decision that would either save American intelligence capabilities or destroy her career and possibly her freedom. Admiral, I am formally requesting implementation of Prometheus Protocol under emergency authority granted by National Security Presidential Directive 77 Alpha. Request granted. You now have autonomous operational authority. God help us all. As Sandra began activating protocols that existed outside of all normal governmental oversight, she realized that the young woman who had been turned away from a military base that morning was gone forever. In her place was someone operating with authority that no intelligence officer in American history had ever wielded, and with responsibilities that could determine whether the United States would emerge from this crisis as a secure nation or a hollow shell controlled by hostile forces. The real battle was just beginning. With Prometheus Protocol activated, Sandra's first action was to establish an independent command structure that operated completely outside traditional government channels. Using the Sentinel device, she began contacting assets that existed in what intelligence professionals called the spaces between. Operatives whose existence was known only to the most senior intelligence officials and whose loyalty was to the Constitution rather than any particular administration. The first person she contacted was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a brilliant analyst who had been quietly working on counterintelligence operations from a nondescript office building in Virginia. Elena's official title was research consultant, but her real job was identifying patterns in global intelligence that suggested long-term hostile operations against American interests. Sandra, I've been expecting your call, Elena said when the secure connection was established. We've been tracking anomalies that suggest systematic penetration of government systems going back at least 2 years. Elena, I need everything you have on Defense Secretary Crawford's activities, associations, and financial records. Also, I need you to identify anyone else who might be part of this network. Already done. Crawford's been meeting regularly with individuals whose backgrounds don't match their official positions. 3 supposed trade representatives who have connections to foreign intelligence services. 2 defense contractors whose companies exist primarily on paper. And most importantly, a State Department official named Richard Kellner who has access to diplomatic channels that could facilitate the kind of information we're seeing. Sandra felt pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Send me everything on Kellner immediately. And Elena, we're operating under Prometheus now. You're no longer constrained by normal oversight protocols. The second call went to Marcus Thompson, not the lieutenant colonel who was in the room with her, but a different Marcus Thompson who worked for a private security firm in Colorado. Marcus Thompson was a former Delta Force operator who now coordinates extraction operations for assets in hostile environments. Thompson, I need immediate extraction teams for compromised operations in 7 countries. Government channels are burned, so we're going to hire a private contractor for everything.
Roger that. How deep is the compromise? Assume everything official is hostile until proven otherwise. We're running independent ops only. Thompson's response was immediate and professional. Understood. Teams will be in position within 12 hours. What's the communication protocol? Sentinel network only. Everything else is to be considered monitored. As Sandra coordinated with assets across the globe, Colonel Whitfield was dealing with the immediate tactical situation at Blackwater. The perimeter attacks had intensified, but something about them felt wrong to his experienced military instincts. "Major Chen," he said, "these attacks are too predictable. Professional hostile forces wouldn't assault a fortified military installation with this kind of obvious approach pattern." Major Chen had reached the same conclusion. "Sir, I think they're trying to keep us pinned down here while the real operations happen elsewhere. This is a distraction." Sandra overheard their conversation and realized they were absolutely correct. "Colonel, the attacks on your base aren't meant to succeed. They're meant to keep us focused on defending this location instead of responding to the real threat." She pulled up real-time intelligence feeds on her Sentinel device and discovered the true scope of what was happening. While they had been dealing with the situation at Blackwater, hostile forces had been systematically dismantling American intelligence networks around the world. Safe houses had been compromised, asset networks had been rolled up. Entire operational infrastructures that had taken decades to build were being destroyed in a matter of hours. "They're not trying to steal our intelligence anymore," Sandra realized. "They're trying to blind us completely." Dr. Elena Vasquez's voice came through the secure channel with urgent news. "Sandra, I've found the connection we needed. Richard Kellner at the State Department has been using diplomatic pouches to transfer encrypted data to foreign contacts. But more importantly, he's been coordinating with Secretary Crawford to identify which intelligence operations could be compromised without triggering immediate security reviews. Meaning they've been carefully selecting targets to maximize damage while minimizing their exposure," Sandra concluded. "Exactly. And based on the pattern, their next target is the Constellation Network." Sandra's blood ran cold. The Constellation Network was America's most sensitive intelligence asset, a web of deep-cover operatives embedded in hostile governments around the world. These weren't just intelligence gatherers. They were individuals who had spent years, sometimes decades, building positions of trust and authority within enemy organizations. If Constellation was compromised, it would represent the loss of intelligence capabilities that couldn't be rebuilt for generations. "Elena, how long do we have before they move on Constellation?" "Based on the pattern, less than 6 hours, maybe less if they know we're onto them." Sandra made a decision that would either preserve America's most valuable intelligence assets or expose them to certain destruction. She activated emergency protocols that had never been used in the field, sending coded messages to Constellation operatives around the world. The message was simple, but carried devastating implications. "Burn everything. Extract immediately. The network is compromised." The response from Constellation operatives was swift and professional, but Sandra could read between the lines of their coded acknowledgments. These were people who had sacrificed everything for their country, building false identities and living lies for years. Now they were being asked to abandon everything and run, destroying intelligence networks that represented lifetimes of careful cultivation. In Moscow, a man who had spent 8 years working his way into a position of trust within Russian military intelligence received Sandra's message while sitting in a meeting that would have provided crucial intelligence about Russian nuclear capabilities. He calmly excused himself to use the restroom, activated an incendiary device that would destroy his apartment and all evidence of his real identity, and walked out of the building knowing he could never return. In Beijing, a woman who had become a trusted advisor to Chinese Communist Party officials received the message during a dinner party that included some of China's most senior intelligence officials.
She smiled, made polite conversation for another hour, then quietly slipped away into the night, leaving behind a life and identity she had maintained for 6 years. In Tehran, an operative embedded within Iran's nuclear program received Sandra's warning just as he was preparing to transmit critical intelligence about uranium enrichment activities. He destroyed his communication equipment, eliminated all traces of his real identity, and began the dangerous journey to an extraction point, knowing that discovery would mean torture and execution. Around the world, America's most valuable intelligence assets were burning their covers and running for their lives based on Sandra's assessment that the network was compromised. If she was wrong, the United States would lose intelligence capabilities that had taken decades to develop. If she was right, she was saving the lives of some of America's most dedicated and vulnerable operatives. Back at Blackwater, the tactical situation was evolving rapidly. The perimeter attacks had suddenly ceased, which Colonel Whitfield correctly interpreted as a bad sign rather than a good one. "They've accomplished whatever they wanted to accomplish," he told Sandra. "The question is, what comes next?" Sandra was monitoring global intelligence traffic through her Sentinel device when she found the answer. "Colonel, we're seeing coordinated movements by hostile intelligence services in multiple countries. They're not just attacking our networks, they're preparing to fill the vacuum left behind." The scope of the operation became clear. By systematically destroying American intelligence capabilities, the hostile forces weren't just blinding the United States. They were creating opportunities for their own intelligence services to expand into areas that had previously been contested. It was a strategic masterstroke that would shift the global balance of intelligence capabilities for decades.
They're reshaping the entire landscape of international intelligence, Sandra said. When this is over, America will be operating from a position of fundamental disadvantage that could take generations to overcome. But even as Sandra coordinated the desperate effort to salvage what remained of American intelligence networks, she began to notice something that didn't fit the pattern. The attacks were too comprehensive, too well coordinated, and too perfectly timed. It was as if the hostile forces had access not just to American intelligence, but to American contingency planning. "Elena," she said over the secure channel, "I need you to check something for me. The Prometheus protocol. Who else knows about its existence?" The pause on Elena's end was longer than Sandra liked. "Sandra, according to the classified records I have access to, there are 12 individuals who know about the Prometheus protocol. But I'm showing 13 authorization codes that have been used to access Prometheus documentation in the past year." Sandra felt the familiar chill of recognition. Someone had been studying America's most secret contingency plans, learning how the intelligence community would respond to exactly the kind of crisis they were now facing. "They've been preparing for our response," she realized. "They know about Prometheus. They know how we operate under these protocols. They've been planning their operation around our contingency procedures." Colonel Whitfield was studying tactical displays when he made a disturbing discovery. "Ma'am, I'm seeing movement patterns around other military installations that suggest coordinated surveillance. Someone has been watching multiple secure facilities simultaneously." Sandra pulled up a global map showing the locations of key intelligence installations, military bases, and government facilities. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The attacks weren't random or opportunistic. They were part of a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been planned with intimate knowledge of American defensive procedures and response protocols. "They haven't just penetrated our intelligence networks," she said quietly. "They've penetrated our planning systems. They know how we think, how we respond, what our contingencies are." Dr. Elena Vasquez's voice came through the secure channel with what might have been the most disturbing intelligence yet. "Sandra, I found evidence of planning documents in classified systems that appear to have been modified by unauthorized users. Someone has been altering our own contingency plans." The implication was staggering. If hostile forces had access to America's contingency planning and had been subtly modifying those plans, then every response to the current crisis might be exactly what the enemy wanted.
The Prometheus Protocol itself might be part of their strategy. Sandra stared at the Sentinel device in her hands, suddenly wondering if her decision to activate autonomous operations had been her own choice or the result of carefully manipulated circumstances designed to lead her to exactly that conclusion. Elena, I need you to verify something critical. Was my emergency summons to Blackwater part of any official contingency plan? The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Elena responded. Sandra, according to classified planning documents, your presence at Blackwater under crisis conditions was identified as a key trigger point for Prometheus Protocol activation. Someone has been planning this exact scenario. Sandra realized that she wasn't fighting an intelligence breach or even a coordinated attack on American assets. She was fighting an enemy who had spent years studying American intelligence procedures, identifying vulnerabilities, and crafting a campaign that would use America's own contingency plans as weapons against the United States. The question now was whether Sandra could outthink an enemy who seemed to know her every move before she made it. Sandra stared at the Sentinel device, her mind racing through the implications of Elena's revelation. If her presence at Blackwater had been anticipated and planned for, then everything that had happened since her arrival might be part of an elaborate manipulation. But rather than paralyze her with doubt, this knowledge sparked a different kind of thinking, the kind that had made her one of the most effective intelligence analysts in the world. Elena, I need you to do something unconventional. Stop analyzing what they want us to do and start analyzing what they don't want us to do. Explain. If they've been planning for our standard responses, including the Prometheus Protocol, then our best chance is to do something completely outside their projections. What would they least expect from our current position? Dr. Elena Vasquez was quiet for several moments before responding. Sandra, based on their planning, they expect us to either try to rebuild our networks or to go defensive and protect what's left. They're not prepared for us to go on the offensive against their command structure. Sandra felt the familiar spark of insight that came when pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly aligned. Because they've been so focused on studying our defensive procedures, they haven't prepared for us to hunt them down directly. Exactly. Their entire operation assumes we'll be reactive rather than proactive. Colonel Whitfield had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding. Ma'am, if I may suggest, we have assets at this base that weren't part of their planning. My special operations personnel weren't included in any intelligence briefings, which means they're unknown variables in their calculations. Sandra looked at Whitfield with new appreciation. Colonel, how many special operations personnel do you have who are completely divorced from intelligence operations? 12 operators who have been assigned to base security and training operations. They have no clearance for intelligence work and no knowledge of current operations, which means they're invisible to anyone who's been monitoring our intelligence networks. Sandra began forming a plan that existed completely outside of established protocols. Colonel, I need those 12 operators prepared for immediate deployment. We're going to use them for something that doesn't exist in any manual. While Sandra coordinated with Whitfield's operators, Dr. Elena Vasquez was conducting her own investigation into the enemy's command structure. What she found challenged every assumption about the scope of the conspiracy. Sandra, the network we're fighting isn't just foreign intelligence services. I'm finding evidence of American citizens in positions of authority who've been working with hostile forces for years. This isn't infiltration, it's a genuine conspiracy that includes our own people. How deep? I've identified at least 7 individuals in government positions who have been receiving payments from foreign sources. 3 State Department officials, 2 Pentagon staff members, 1 NSA analyst, and someone in the CIA whose identity is still encrypted.
Sandra felt the magnitude of betrayal settling over her. These weren't foreign spies who had infiltrated the American government. These were Americans who had chosen to betray their own country for money or ideology. Elena, I need locations for all of them. Real-time locations, not office addresses. Sandra, what are you planning? Something they won't see coming because it's not in any protocol they've studied. Sandra turned to Colonel Whitfield. Colonel, your operators are about to become part of an operation that technically doesn't exist. Are they prepared for assignments that may never be officially acknowledged? Whitfield's expression was grim but determined. Ma'am, these are operators who joined special forces to serve their country. If you're asking whether they'll take action against traitors, the answer is yes. Then we're going to simultaneously hit 7 locations across the country and extract these conspirators before they can coordinate a response. The plan Sandra outlined was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to outmaneuver enemies who knew their every protocol, they would use assets that existed outside of those protocols to conduct operations that had never been planned for. 12 special operations personnel would simultaneously hit 7 targets, extract the conspirators, and bring them to secure locations for immediate interrogation. Ma'am, Major Chen interjected, what you're describing sounds like domestic arrests without warrants or legal authority. Major, under Prometheus Protocol, we're operating outside of normal legal constraints because normal legal systems have been compromised. These individuals have committed treason during wartime. Traditional legal procedures don't apply. Sandra began coordinating the most complex operation of her career, using resources that officially didn't exist to target enemies who had been planning for every response except the one she was implementing. Dr. Elena Vasquez provided real-time intelligence on target locations. Colonel Whitfield's operators prepared for simultaneous strikes across multiple states, and Sandra used the Sentinel device to coordinate with additional assets that existed in the shadows of the intelligence community. The first target was Richard Kellner, the State Department official who had been using diplomatic channels to transfer intelligence to foreign contacts. Elena's surveillance showed him at his private residence in Arlington, Virginia, apparently conducting a video conference with unknown parties. Team Alpha, Sandra said into the secure communication system. Target 1 is at home conducting what appears to be a coordination meeting with foreign contacts. Priority is live capture with minimal disruption to ongoing communications. Team Alpha copies, moving to position. The second target was Dr. Patricia Wong, a Pentagon analyst who had been providing detailed information about American military capabilities to foreign intelligence services. Elena's tracking showed her at a restaurant in Alexandria, meeting with 2 individuals whose identities didn't match their official covers. Team Beta, Target 2 is conducting face-to-face meetings with suspected foreign operatives. Capture all 3 individuals. Team Beta moving. As Sandra coordinated the simultaneous operations, she began to understand the true scope of what they were fighting. The conspiracy wasn't just about stealing secrets or compromising operations. It was about fundamentally altering the balance of global power by destroying America's ability to conduct effective intelligence operations. Elena, she said during a brief pause in operational coordination, what's the long-term strategic goal of this operation? What do they achieve by destroying our intelligence networks? Sandra, based on the pattern of targets and the timing of attacks, I believe they're preparing for a major geopolitical shift. By blinding American intelligence capabilities, they're creating conditions for territorial expansion, regime changes, or other strategic moves that would normally trigger American responses. The implication was sobering. The conspiracy wasn't just an intelligence operation. It was preparation for actions that could reshape global power structures while America was unable to see them coming or respond effectively. Sandra's coordination was interrupted by reports from the field. Team Alpha had successfully captured Richard Kellner, but his computer showed evidence that he had been in communication with hostile forces just minutes before the arrest. Team Beta had captured Dr. Patricia Wong and her 2 contacts, but surveillance equipment at the restaurant suggested their meeting had been recorded by additional parties.
They know we're coming, Sandra realized. Even though we're operating outside their predicted responses, they have fallback surveillance that's detecting our operations. Colonel Whitfield was monitoring tactical communications when he made a disturbing discovery. Ma'am, we're detecting communication intercepts suggesting that hostile forces are preparing to activate sleeper assets within the United States. Sleeper assets? Individuals who have been placed in positions within American society but haven't been active until now. Based on the intercepted communications, they're being activated for some kind of coordinated action. Sandra felt the scope of the threat expanding beyond anything she had previously imagined. Elena, how many potential sleeper assets are we talking about? Sandra, based on analysis of financial transfers and communication patterns, potentially hundreds of individuals across the country. They've been building this network for years. The realization hit Sandra like a physical blow. The intelligence operation she had been fighting was just the beginning. The real attack would come from assets that had been secretly positioned throughout American society. People who appeared to be ordinary citizens but were actually enemy operatives waiting for activation. This isn't just about intelligence, she said. They're preparing for domestic terrorism on a massive scale.
As if summoned by her words, reports began coming in from across the country. Explosions at infrastructure targets, cyber attacks on financial systems, coordinated disruptions of communication networks. The sleeper assets weren't just being activated, they were implementing a plan to cripple America's domestic infrastructure while the intelligence community was distracted by the hunt for conspirators. Sandra realized that even her unconventional response had been anticipated to some degree. The enemy hadn't planned for her specific tactics, but they had prepared for the possibility that their intelligence operation might be discovered. The activation of sleeper assets was their contingency plan. Elena, we need to shift focus immediately. Forget the remaining conspirators for now. We need to identify and neutralize the sleeper network before they can complete whatever they're planning. Sandra, that's impossible. We don't have the resources to conduct counter-terrorism operations across the entire country. Then we need to think like they do. Instead of trying to stop hundreds of attacks, we need to find their command and control structure and cut off their ability to coordinate. Sandra began analyzing the pattern of attacks that were already underway. Infrastructure targets in major cities, financial systems in economic centers, communication networks that connected different regions of the country. The attacks weren't random. They were designed to isolate different parts of the United States from each other and from central government control. They're trying to fragment the country, she realized. By disrupting communication and transportation between regions, they're making it impossible for the federal government to coordinate an effective response. Colonel Whitfield was receiving urgent reports from military installations across the country. Ma'am, we're seeing similar patterns of attack near multiple military bases. Someone is trying to isolate military assets from Central Command. The full scope of the enemy's strategy became clear. They weren't just attacking American intelligence capabilities. They were implementing a comprehensive plan to disrupt American society so thoroughly that the federal government would lose the ability to function effectively. It was a form of warfare that targeted the fundamental structures that held the country together. Sandra made a decision that would either save American society or accelerate its collapse. Elena, I need you to identify every major communication hub, transportation nexus, and power distribution center in the country. We're going to predict their next targets and get there first. Sandra, that's not intelligence work. That's domestic warfare. Elena, we passed the point of normal intelligence work when they activated sleeper cells across the country. We're now fighting for the continued existence of a functional American government. As Sandra began coordinating what amounted to a domestic military campaign against enemy assets embedded throughout American society, she wondered if the young woman who had been turned away from a base gate that morning would recognize the person she had become.
The parameters of the conflict had expanded so far beyond traditional intelligence work that she was essentially operating as a wartime commander in a conflict that most Americans didn't even know was happening. But the enemy had made one crucial miscalculation. In their focus on studying American government responses and intelligence protocols, they had underestimated the determination of individual Americans to fight for their country when its existence was genuinely threatened. Sandra wasn't just following protocols anymore. She was improvising solutions that existed outside of any manual or contingency plan. The real test would come in the next hours, when her improvised response would either contain the enemy's coordinated attack or prove insufficient to prevent the collapse of American governmental authority. The interrogation of Richard Kellner produced intelligence that transformed Sandra's understanding of the enemy's timeline. Under questioning at a secure facility outside of Washington, D.C., Kellner revealed that the current wave of attacks was merely the opening phase of what they called Operation Fracture, a comprehensive plan to permanently disable American governmental authority within 72 hours. "They're not trying to conquer America," Kellner said, his voice hollow with the realization of what he had helped set in motion. "They're trying to make it ungovernable. The idea is to create so much chaos and disruption that state governments will declare independence from federal authority to protect their own populations." Sandra felt ice form in her veins. The enemy wasn't planning a traditional invasion or occupation. They were engineering the voluntary dissolution of the United States of America. "What's the next phase?" she demanded. "Simultaneous attacks on the electrical grid in 12 major metropolitan areas. When the power goes out, emergency services will be overwhelmed, communication between states will break down, and local governments will have to choose between federal directives they can't receive or implementing their own emergency measures." Sandra immediately contacted Dr. Alina Vasquez with this intelligence. "Alina, we need the locations of every major electrical distribution facility in 12 metropolitan areas. Also, I need you to hack into power company security systems and look for signs of infiltration." "Sandra, what you're asking for would require me to commit multiple federal crimes." "Alina, if we don't commit those crimes, there won't be a federal government left to prosecute them." While Alina worked to identify vulnerable electrical infrastructure, Sandra faced a strategic decision that would define the outcome of the crisis. She could attempt to defend all 12 potential targets, spreading her limited resources thin and likely failing to prevent most of the attacks. Or she could gamble everything on identifying the enemy's command center and eliminating their ability to coordinate the remaining phases of Operation Fracture. Colonel Whitfield's special operations teams had successfully captured 4 of the 7 conspirators, but each arrest had provided diminishing intelligence returns. The conspiracy was compartmentalized enough that lower-level participants didn't know the overall structure or timeline. "Ma'am, we're receiving intelligence that suggests the enemy command structure is mobile. They're not operating from a fixed location that we can target." Sandra studied the pattern of communication that Dr. Alina Vasquez had identified. The coordination messages for Operation Fracture were being routed through a complex network of encrypted channels that changed locations every few hours. But there was something about the routing pattern that suggested sophistication beyond what even well-funded foreign intelligence services typically possessed. "Alina, the communication infrastructure they're using, does it match the capabilities of any known intelligence service?" "Sandra, this is more advanced than anything I've seen from foreign services. The encryption protocols, the routing sophistication, the real-time coordination capabilities, this looks like technology that should only be available to American intelligence agencies." The implication hit Sandra like a physical blow. They're using our own communication systems against us. More than that, I think they're using American intelligence infrastructure that's been captured or compromised. Someone with access to NSA or CIA communication systems is facilitating this operation.
Sandra realized that the conspiracy reached even deeper into the intelligence community than they had suspected. The enemy wasn't just using stolen American secrets. They were using American intelligence technology and infrastructure to conduct their attack on America. Elena, I need you to identify which intelligence systems are being used without proper authorization. Can you trace the routing back to specific NSA or CIA nodes? Sandra, that would require me to hack into the most secure intelligence systems in the world. Do it. At this point, we're fighting for the survival of the country. Normal restrictions don't apply. As Elena began her unprecedented penetration of American intelligence systems, Sandra received updates from Colonel Whitfield's teams in the field. The scope of the sleeper network was becoming clear, and it was larger than anyone had imagined. Ma'am, we're identifying sleeper assets and positions throughout critical infrastructure. Power plant technicians who aren't who they claim to be. Transportation workers with access to major highways and railways. Communication technicians with access to internet routing centers. They've positioned people everywhere. Sandra began to understand the true genius of Operation Fracture. Instead of trying to destroy American infrastructure through external attacks, the enemy had spent years placing their own people in positions where they could disable that infrastructure from within. When the electrical grid failed, it would be because power plant workers had sabotaged their own facilities. When transportation networks collapsed, it would be because the people responsible for maintaining them had deliberately caused failures. They've weaponized our own infrastructure against us, she realized. Dr. Elena Vasquez's voice came through the secure channel with urgent news. Sandra, I've found the source of their communication capabilities. They're using a classified NSA system called Blackbird that was designed for emergency coordination during catastrophic events. Someone with NSA access is facilitating this operation? Sandra, it's worse than that. The Blackbird system can only be activated by someone with director-level authorization codes. This isn't just a rogue analyst. This is someone at the very top of the intelligence hierarchy. Sandra felt the scope of betrayal expanding beyond anything she had previously imagined. If someone with director-level access was coordinating Operation Fracture, then the conspiracy included individuals with the authority to access America's most sensitive intelligence capabilities. Elena, who has director-level access to Blackbird? According to the access logs, only 3 people. NSA Director Catherine Wells, Deputy Director Michael Foster, and… Sandra, this can't be right. Who? You. Your authorization codes show access to Blackbird within the past 6 hours. Sandra stared at the Sentinel device in disbelief. Elena, I've never heard of Blackbird, and I certainly haven't accessed any NSA systems today. Sandra, either someone is using your authorization codes without your knowledge, or what? Or your Sentinel device is connected to systems you don't know about. Sandra looked at the device she had been using to coordinate the entire operation against the conspiracy. The possibility that her primary communication tool was actually connected to the enemy's command structure was almost too horrifying to contemplate. Elena, how do I verify whether my Sentinel device is compromised? Sandra, there's no way to test it without potentially alerting anyone who might be monitoring it. But I can tell you that the Blackbird system shows continuous activity from your authorization codes throughout this entire crisis. Sandra faced a choice that could determine the outcome of Operation Fracture. She could continue using the Sentinel device, knowing it might be compromised, but also knowing it was her primary means of coordinating defensive operations. Or she could abandon it and lose her ability to communicate with assets across the globe just when coordination was most critical. Elena, assuming my Sentinel is compromised, how much of our operation would the enemy know about? Sandra, they would know everything, every conversation, every plan, every asset deployment. They would have been listening to our entire response from the beginning. The realization that the enemy might have been monitoring her coordination efforts throughout the crisis was devastating, but it also provided Sandra with a strategic opportunity.
If they had been listening to everything, then they would know about her plans to defend the electrical grid. But they wouldn't know about plans she hadn't made yet. Elena, I'm going to give you coordinates for a dead drop location. I need you to physically go there and retrieve a package. Do not use any electronic communication for this task. Sandra, what kind of package? Contingency assets that exist outside of all electronic systems. People and resources that were established during the Cold War for scenarios exactly like this one. Sandra was activating the most secret elements of American intelligence capabilities. Assets that had been created during the height of the Cold War, when the possibility of complete system compromise was considered a genuine threat. Colonel Whitfield watched Sandra make preparations that he didn't fully understand, but recognized as the actions of someone implementing last resort measures. Ma'am, what exactly are we activating?
Colonel, during the Cold War, intelligence planners anticipated the possibility that our entire governmental structure might be compromised or destroyed. They created backup systems, people, resources, and capabilities that could function independently of all official channels. We're about to find out if those systems still exist. The package that Dr. Elena Vasquez retrieved from the dead drop location contained information that hadn't been updated since 1987, but which represented the deepest contingency planning in American intelligence history. Contact codes for assets who maintained their readiness despite decades of inactivity. Resource caches hidden in locations across the country. Communication methods that predated modern electronic systems. Sandra, Elena said, when she re-established contact using a method that involved shortwave radio encoded messages, "What I found suggests that someone anticipated exactly this kind of crisis 30 years ago." What kind of assets are we talking about? Independent operators with their own resources, communication networks that don't rely on modern infrastructure, and most importantly, individuals who have been maintaining surveillance on potential threats for decades without any official oversight. Sandra realized that she was about to activate intelligence capabilities that existed so far outside normal government operations that their actions could never be officially acknowledged. These were resources that had been created for the possibility that the United States government might be completely compromised and need to be rebuilt from the shadows. Elena, activate all of them. Tell them that the scenario they've been preparing for has arrived. As Sandra coordinated with assets that officially didn't exist to combat an enemy that had infiltrated the highest levels of government, she understood that the morning's events had led to a confrontation that would determine whether the United States continued to exist as a functioning nation or became a collection of isolated regions controlled by whoever could maintain local authority. The young woman who had been refused entry to a military base had become the coordinator of America's last resort defense against enemies who had spent years planning for exactly this moment. The question now was whether resources created during a previous crisis would prove adequate for threats that had evolved far beyond what Cold War planners had imagined. The final phase of Operation Fracture was scheduled to begin in less than 12 hours, and Sandra was running out of time to prevent the permanent fragmentation of American governmental authority. The activation of Cold War contingency assets produced results that exceeded Sandra's most optimistic expectations. Within hours of Elena's coded transmissions, operatives who had maintained their readiness for over 3 decades began reporting in through communication methods that predated digital technology entirely. The first to respond was a man who identified himself only as Watchman 7, a former CIA operative who had spent 30 years running a small electronics repair shop in Nebraska while secretly maintaining surveillance on suspicious activities in America's heartland. His report was devastating in its implications. "I've been tracking unusual activity in agricultural centers across the Midwest for the past 6 months. Foreign nationals have been purchasing farmland adjacent to critical transportation routes and water supplies. Based on current positioning, they could simultaneously disrupt food distribution to major population centers." Sandra realized that Operation Fracture extended beyond infrastructure attacks to include control of America's food supply, a dimension of the threat that no one had anticipated.
The second response came from Cardinal 3, a woman who had maintained cover as a small-town librarian in Montana while secretly monitoring communications equipment that could intercept foreign intelligence transmissions. Her intelligence was equally alarming. "I've been detecting coordinated communications between cells across the northern border states. The communication pattern suggests preparation for some kind of coordinated action that would cut off the northern United States from the southern regions." Sandra began to see the full scope of Operation Fracture. The enemy wasn't just planning to disrupt American infrastructure, they were planning to physically divide the country into isolated regions that couldn't support each other during a crisis. Dr. Elena Vasquez, now operating from a location that existed outside of all modern surveillance systems, provided the final piece of the puzzle. "Sandra, I've identified the true command structure. Operation Fracture isn't being directed by foreign intelligence services. It's being coordinated by a network of American officials who believe that the United States has become too powerful and needs to be broken apart for global stability." The revelation that Operation Fracture was essentially a conspiracy by American officials to destroy their own country was almost beyond comprehension. These weren't foreign spies or enemy operatives, they were Americans who had decided that America itself was the problem. "Who's leading it?" Sandra asked. "Defense Secretary Crawford is the operational coordinator, but the strategic planning is coming from a group that includes officials from the State Department, NSA, and CIA. They call themselves the Reset Committee, and they believe that America's global dominance is destabilizing the world." Sandra felt a cold fury building that was different from anything she had experienced in her intelligence career. These people had taken oaths to defend the Constitution and protect American interests, and they were using their positions of trust to systematically destroy the country they had sworn to serve. "Elena, I need locations for all Reset Committee members. Not office locations, personal locations where they feel secure." "Sandra, what are you planning?" "I'm planning to end this conspiracy by removing the people who are directing it." The plan Sandra developed went far beyond anything in established intelligence protocols. Using the Cold War assets, she would simultaneously strike at every member of the Reset Committee during what they believed was a secure coordination meeting. But first, she needed to ensure that the meeting would actually take place. "Elena, using the compromised Sentinel device, I want you to send a message that will convince the Reset Committee that their operation is succeeding ahead of schedule." "What kind of message?" "Tell them that American intelligence capabilities have been so thoroughly disrupted that they should accelerate their timeline and implement the final phase of Operation Fracture immediately."
Sandra was gambling that the Reset Committee's arrogance would overcome their caution. If they believed their operation was succeeding beyond their expectations, they might gather in person to coordinate the final attacks, providing Sandra with an opportunity to eliminate the entire conspiracy leadership simultaneously. The message Elena sent through the compromised Sentinel device was carefully crafted to appeal to the conspirators' sense of victory. It reported that Sandra Martinez had been captured, that resistance to Operation Fracture had collapsed, and that conditions were perfect for implementing the final phase ahead of schedule. The response came within hours. The Reset Committee scheduled an emergency coordination meeting at a secure facility in rural Virginia, a location they believed was unknown to American intelligence services. What they didn't know was that Watchman 12 had been monitoring that facility for 15 years from a position in the nearby mountains, carefully documenting everyone who entered and left. When Elena's coded transmission reached him, he was ready with detailed intelligence about the facility's security, layout, and vulnerabilities. Sandra coordinated the final operation using communication methods that the conspirators couldn't monitor because they predated the technology they had compromised. Shortwave radio transmissions, coded newspaper advertisements, and physical dead drops allowed her to position assets for what would either be the most important victory in American intelligence history or a catastrophic failure that would complete the destruction of American governmental authority. Colonel Whitfield's Special Operations personnel were deployed to secure the perimeter around the Virginia facility. Cold War assets positioned themselves to intercept any communications from the meeting. Dr. Elena Vasquez prepared to simultaneously disable the technological infrastructure that the conspirators had been using to coordinate sleeper cell activities across the country. As the Reset Committee members arrived at their meeting location, they believed they were gathering to celebrate the successful implementation of Operation Fracture. Defense Secretary Crawford arrived first, followed by State Department officials Richard Kellner and Patricia Morrison. NSA Deputy Director Michael Foster came next, accompanied by CIA official James Richardson. The final attendee was someone whose presence shocked even Sandra, Admiral Sarah Mitchell, the Director of National Intelligence, who had been part of the video conference that authorized the Prometheus Protocol. "Elena," Sandra said grimly, "Admiral Mitchell has been playing both sides throughout this entire crisis." "Sandra, that means everything she authorized, including the Prometheus Protocol, was designed to serve the conspiracy's purposes." Sandra realized that even her activation of emergency authorities had been anticipated and manipulated by the conspiracy. Admiral Mitchell had authorized the Prometheus Protocol, knowing that it would isolate Sandra and her assets from normal oversight, making it easier to eliminate them once Operation Fracture was complete. But the conspirators had made one crucial miscalculation. In their focus on manipulating official intelligence capabilities, they had forgotten about resources that existed outside of all official systems. The Cold War assets that Sandra had activated were invisible to their planning because those assets had been specifically designed to operate independently of any governmental authority. "All units," Sandra transmitted using an encrypted shortwave system, "commence Operation Restoration." The assault on the Virginia facility was swift and precise. Colonel Whitfield's operators neutralized external security while Cold War assets disabled communication equipment. Within minutes, the entire Reset Committee was captured before they could implement any of their contingency plans. But Sandra's victory came with a terrible cost. As interrogation of the conspiracy members began, the full scope of the damage they had caused became clear. Hundreds of American intelligence assets around the world had been burned. Decades of carefully constructed networks had been destroyed. The United States would require years to rebuild intelligence capabilities that had been eliminated in a matter of days. Admiral Mitchell, when confronted with evidence of her betrayal, remained defiant. "You think you've won something significant," she said. "All you've done is preserve a system that's destroying global stability. American intelligence dominance has prevented other nations from developing effective security capabilities." "So you decided to destroy your own country to level the playing field?" Sandra asked. "We decided to prevent America from becoming so powerful that it destabilizes the entire world. Operation Fracture was designed to reduce American capabilities to sustainable levels." Sandra looked at the woman who had held one of the highest intelligence positions in the American government and felt a mixture of rage and pity. Mitchell and her co-conspirators had convinced themselves that betraying their country was actually a form of patriotism. The aftermath of Operation Restoration revealed the true extent of foreign involvement in the conspiracy. While the Reset Committee had provided the coordination and access, foreign intelligence services had supplied funding, technology, and operational support. The conspiracy represented a new form of warfare in which hostile nations used Americans' own ideological divisions against them. Dr. Elena Vasquez's analysis of captured documents showed that similar operations were being planned against other Western democracies. Operation Fracture was intended to be the first of several coordinated attacks designed to reduce Western intelligence capabilities and create opportunities for authoritarian regimes to expand their influence. "Sandra," Elena reported, "we've prevented the immediate collapse of American governmental authority, but we haven't eliminated the threat. The foreign services that supported this operation are already adapting their approach based on what they learned." Sandra understood that her victory was incomplete. While she had stopped Operation Fracture and captured the Reset Committee, the underlying vulnerabilities that had made the conspiracy possible still existed. Foreign nations would continue to exploit American political divisions, and there would always be individuals willing to betray their country for ideological or financial reasons. Colonel Whitfield supervised the secure detention of the conspiracy members, while Sandra coordinated with Elena to assess the damage to American intelligence capabilities.
The cost had been enormous, but not irreparable. More importantly, the crisis had revealed the existence of contingency resources that few people had known existed.
"Ma'am," Whitfield said, "what happens to the Cold War assets who responded to your activation codes?" "Colonel, those people have spent decades maintaining their readiness to serve their country in its darkest hour. They've earned the right to return to their cover lives with the knowledge that they helped save American democracy." Sandra looked around the command center at Blackwater, remembering the morning when she had been refused entry by guards who couldn't recognize the clearance level on her identification card. The young woman who had sat in a rental car in the Arizona heat had been transformed by events that tested the very foundations of American society. The Sentinel device that had been her primary communication tool throughout the crisis was destroyed, along with all evidence of the technological capabilities that the enemy had compromised. New systems would be developed, with safeguards designed to prevent the kind of infiltration that had made Operation Fracture possible. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged from her hidden location to oversee the reconstruction of intelligence networks that would be more secure and more resilient than their predecessors. The lessons learned from the conspiracy would inform American intelligence operations for generations. As Sandra prepared to return to her normal duties, she reflected on the cost of victory. American intelligence capabilities had been severely damaged, but American democracy had survived. The country would emerge from the crisis stronger and more aware of the threats it faced. The final report on Operation Fracture and Operation Restoration would be classified at levels that ensured it would never be publicly acknowledged. The American people would never know how close their country had come to voluntary dissolution, or how a woman whose clearance couldn't be recognized by military guards had ultimately preserved the Union. Sandra Martinez returned to her modest apartment in Tucson, officially just another defense intelligence analyst whose work would never be publicly recognized. But she carried with her the knowledge that when American democracy faced its greatest test, ordinary people with extraordinary dedication had proven capable of preserving the freedoms that defined their nation. The conspiracy had been defeated, but the vigilance required to protect democracy would continue forever. And somewhere in the shadows of the intelligence community, new watchers would maintain their readiness for the next time America's enemies tried to use its own freedoms against it. 3 months after Operation Restoration, Sandra received a secure communication that would once again test her resolve. Intelligence agencies across Europe were reporting similar patterns of infiltration and manipulation. The techniques perfected during Operation Fracture were being adapted for use against NATO allies, with particular focus on countries whose democratic institutions had shown recent stress. Dr. Elena Vasquez had established a new analysis center, officially designated as a research institute, but actually serving as an early warning system for the kind of deep penetration conspiracies that had nearly destroyed American intelligence capabilities. Her first major finding was disturbing. The Reset Committee had been part of a larger international network of officials who believed that Western democratic dominance needed to be systematically dismantled. Sandra, Elena reported during a briefing at the reconstituted Blackwater facility, "We're seeing evidence of similar cells in Britain, France, Germany, and Canada. The operational model they're using is almost identical to what we faced, trusted officials using their access to facilitate attacks on their own country's capabilities." Colonel Whitfield, now permanently assigned to coordinate unconventional threat response, had been developing new protocols for identifying and neutralizing insider threats. His work had revealed disturbing patterns in recruitment and radicalization of government officials. "Ma'am, the psychological profile of Reset Committee members suggests they were specifically targeted and cultivated over periods of years, sometimes decades. Someone has been running a very sophisticated operation to identify officials who could be convinced that betraying their countries was actually a form of higher patriotism." Sandra realized that Operation Fracture had been just one component of a global strategy designed to weaken Western intelligence and military capabilities simultaneously. The enemy's long-term goal wasn't to conquer Western nations through traditional warfare, but to convince Western officials to dismantle their own defensive capabilities voluntarily.
The investigation into international connections led Sandra to Geneva, where she met with counterparts from Allied intelligence services. What she learned during those classified briefings painted a picture of coordinated subversion that spanned multiple continents and had been in development for over a decade. British MI6 had identified 3 senior officials whose financial records showed unexplained wealth that correlated with their access to sensitive military planning. French intelligence had discovered that critical NATO coordination protocols had been compromised by someone with authorization to modify alliance procedures. German security services had found evidence that their counterterrorism capabilities had been systematically degraded by officials who appeared to be acting in good faith. The pattern is identical everywhere, Sandra told Elena during a secure video conference from Geneva. They identify officials who have ideological doubts about their country's international roles, then slowly cultivate those doubts into active betrayal. Sandra, if this is happening across all major Western democracies simultaneously, we're looking at the most sophisticated influence operation in history. Someone has been planning this for longer than we initially realized. Sandra's investigation in Geneva revealed the existence of what intelligence professionals had begun calling the Doubt Network, a web of contacts, financial incentives, and ideological reinforcement designed to convert patriotic officials into active saboteurs. The network operated through academic conferences, think tanks, and cultural exchange programs that provided cover for recruitment and coordination activities. The most disturbing discovery came when Sandra identified the ultimate source of funding for the Doubt Network. Financial analysis revealed a complex web of shell companies and charitable foundations that traced back to a consortium of authoritarian governments working in unprecedented coordination. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea had set aside their traditional rivalries to fund a joint operation against Western democratic institutions. They've recognized that they can't defeat Western military capabilities through direct confrontation, so they've invested in a strategy that turns Western officials into unwitting allies in their own country's destruction. The scope of the threat had grown beyond anything that individual nations could address independently. Sandra found herself coordinating the development of new international protocols for identifying and neutralizing insider threats across alliance structures. The work required unprecedented cooperation between intelligence services that had traditionally guarded their methods and sources jealously. 6 months after Operation Restoration, Sandra was appointed to lead a new international task force dedicated to combating what had been officially designated as advanced persistent infiltration, the systematic corruption of government officials by hostile foreign powers. Her first assignment was to develop countermeasures that could identify potential recruits for organizations like the Reset Committee before they could be fully compromised.
The work was painstaking and often frustrating. Unlike traditional espionage, which involved foreign agents stealing secrets, advanced persistent infiltration involved converting loyal officials into genuine believers in their own country's inherent evil. Combating it required understanding not just intelligence techniques, but psychology, sociology, and political theory. Sandra's team developed new screening procedures for officials with access to sensitive information. But the real breakthrough came when they began studying the recruitment materials used by the Doubt Network. The enemy's psychological manipulation techniques were sophisticated, but they followed predictable patterns that could be identified and countered. The key insight, Sandra explained to a classified briefing of Allied intelligence chiefs, is that they don't try to turn patriots into traitors overnight. They gradually convince people that their patriotism requires them to work against their own governments. It's a form of ideological jujitsu that uses people's love of country as leverage against their country's interests. The countermeasures Sandra's team developed included psychological inoculation programs for officials with high-level clearances, improved monitoring of financial irregularities that might indicate foreign influence, and most importantly, education about the techniques used to gradually convert loyalty into betrayal. 1 year after the morning when she had been refused entry to Blackwater installation, Sandra Martinez stood before a joint session of the intelligence committees of 5 allied nations.
Her briefing on advanced persistent infiltration and the countermeasures developed to combat it would shape intelligence cooperation for decades to come. The lesson of Operation Fracture, she concluded, is that our enemies have evolved beyond traditional espionage. They now seek to destroy us by convincing us to destroy ourselves. Our response must evolve accordingly, focusing not just on protecting our secrets, but on protecting the loyalty and judgment of the people we entrust with those secrets. The young woman who had once sat in a rental car in the Arizona desert, frustrated by guards who couldn't recognize her clearance, had become one of the most influential intelligence professionals of her generation. But more importantly, she had helped preserve the democratic institutions that made such careers possible in the first place. The threat would continue to evolve, and new challenges would emerge. But Sandra Martinez had proven that when democracy faced its darkest tests, ordinary people with extraordinary dedication could still tip the balance toward freedom. The price of liberty remained eternal vigilance, and that vigilance would continue as long as people like Sandra were willing to pay it. Up next, you've got 2 more stand-up stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.